Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to deviate slightly from my usual content, as I'm going to be delivering a bit of a history lesson with reference to my childhood. You've all seen the title, you know what this video is about. Without further ado, on with the video. Okay, so, in my personal life I'm kinda known for my love of spooky things. I've tried to implement this love throughout my channel, through the design of its assets and a lot of the media I review. This didn't suddenly spring up overnight though. My passion for the macabre has been developing over many years since I was a very small child. In this video, I shall be going over the history of vampires and werewolves, and then briefly discussing various media surrounding these creatures and how they impacted me, before coming to my conclusion. All articles that I've used in my research will be linked in the description as always if any of you are interested. Unbeknownst to some, our favourite undead bloodsuckers did not start out as attractive shiny people. The concept of the vampire comes from traditional European beliefs about how if a corpse identified as a vampire was not buried appropriately, it would come back to terrorize the living. To prevent this, the locals would use the now well-known methods of a stake through the heart, various religious items, and yes, even garlic. These practices are often attributed to people back then misunderstanding stages of decomposition, such as mistaking flesh shrinking around teeth and fingernails for growth, and the fluid leaking from the body during putrefaction as blood. The vampire as we know it today comes from Victorian Gothic fiction. Famous stories include The Vampire by Polidori, who wrote it in the famous contest with his friends Mary and Percy Shelley. Vampiric lesbianism is often attributed to being popularized by the 1872 novella Carmilla. I guess what they say is true. The Victorians really were gay. Of course, I can't talk about vampirism in Victorian fiction without bringing up the most culturally influential book in terms of ingraining the modern idea of a vampire into our society. Dracula, by one of Aleister Crowley's most famous alleged associates, Bram Stoker. Growing up, Dracula fascinated me as a story, and with it being such a famous story, of course, that led to many film adaptations. After Germany's adaptation, Nosferatu was thought to have been destroyed due to copyright infringement, and Hungary's Dracula's death now being thought to have been lost to time. The next earliest adaptation of the Dracula story is Todd Browning's 1931 film, Dracula. This is the Count Dracula that influenced generations to come, Bela Lugosi's Hungarian accent being imitated and recycled for decades after the film's release. Dracula's design in this movie became a staple in what makes a vampire. The slicked back hair with the widow's peak, the cape, the archaic aristocratic clothing, not to mention that this was the first talkie adaptation of Stoker's novel. I cannot stress how important this movie was culturally. As a young'un, I was first introduced to horror through Universal's adaptations, as those were the films of the genre that I was allowed to watch at that age. I loved the black and white aesthetic of the film, and the now outdated use of the transatlantic accent, as well as the classic story of good triumphing over evil. Compared to the media of the 2000s, I found these films almost magical, like a real-life fairy tale. Despite all this though, much like my favourite Gothic children's filmmaker, I personally much preferred Universal's Frankenstein. After making my way through the American Universal's films, a studio closer to home made its way into my sights. Hammer Film Productions. Hammer's Universal remakes were a standard within my family. I often heard of my grandparents parents and their siblings, growing up watching Dracula with Christopher Lee before going to bed frightened. Whereas Universal's adaptation was theatrical and full of wonder to me, this was something else. It was brash, dramatic, and in colour, the blood brightly radiating off the television screen. Dracula was always portrayed as somewhat predatory with an air of mystique. He was demonic, inhuman, but Lee's on-screen presence was pure evil, commanding, and violently brutish at times. But he was calculated, and often in an almost gentlemanly fashion. I think this film, and its ridiculous string of sequels, was the beginning of the widespread romanticization of the vampire. I didn't just watch films as a child, although I did prefer them to TV, but a more tame presentation of vampirism adapted for children was the show Mona the Vampire. Based on a book series by Sonia Hollyman, this show centered around a little girl called Mona, who thwarted threats to her community through her overactive imagination. She was joined by her cat Fang and her two friends, Charlie and Lily, and they would partake in their shenanigans while as their alter egos, Mona the Vampire, Zapman, and Princess Giant. I never indulged in the books, but I really liked this show as a kid, and we had all the episodes on DVD. I remember being really fixated on the episode Sam and Ella, but I guess that also explains my interest in biology. I really liked all of the characters, even the villains, and I also remember being really jealous of Mona's pajamas and wanting a pair. The other vampire-themed show I really enjoyed as a kid was the show Young Dracula. I know I have mentioned it multiple times on the channel before, and I do plan on releasing a video about it specifically in the future, but I feel like I must emphasize how much this show exacerbated my love of vampires as a small child, particularly the earlier seasons. The show didn't take itself too seriously then, and was just generally pretty funny and based. The mum was also a complete MILF despite how fucking evil she was, even for a vampire. Much like Mona the Vampire, this was also based on literary work that I didn't read as a child. In fact, I didn't know it existed until relatively recently. But my indulgence in vampire media didn't just stop at kid shows and century-year-old films. I also really liked, and still like, 80s vampire films. I liked The Lost Boys and The Monster Squad, but the film that really gripped me was 1985's Fright Night. I can only estimate the amount of times I've seen this movie. It's probably in the hundreds. In my early teens, I watched it every night before I went to sleep for several months. That is how much I loved this film. Fright Night is a modern retelling / parody of the aforementioned vampire movies of the old. The story centers around Charlie, a teenage boy who is obsessed with old horror films, and notices that strange happenings are going on with his new neighbour Jerry Dandridge, who is played by Chris Sarandon. He fights off this threat with a retiring movie star, Peter Vincent, a portmanteau of horror icons Peter Cushing and Vincent Price, saving his community and his girlfriend in the process. The 80s practical effects are amazing, and Sarandon looks really handsome, even in his little jumper getup. The Munsters. Often overlooked and overshadowed by the Addams Family, The Munsters was a wholesome but darkly humorous show centering around a family of monsters who lived in a neighborhood of quiveringly fearful humans. The vampires of the show were Lily Munster, the matriarch of the family, and her father, the Count. Even through the black and white camera, I think Yvonne De Carlo's beauty really shines through, and her character as Lily is very sweet and caring. Her father is often mischievous, especially with his alchemy, but his intentions are always good, and his relationship with the other family members is very endearing, particularly the one he shares with Herman.
But there's just one thing, Grandpa. This may lead to bloodshed.
Oh, Herman, this is no time to be looking at the bright side. Get down there!
The Count's drag racing car, the Dracula, also served as the inspiration for Rob Zombie's 1998 song of the same name, which I quite enjoy listening to from time to time. Something that has fascinated me about mythology surrounding therianthropy and shapeshifting is just how ancient and universal it is. It seems that no matter when or where in the world you go to, there is some kind of myth like this. It's as if we have always had an obsession with trying to reach or combat humanity's more animalistic characteristics. The deities of ancient Egypt are often depicted as having animal heads or being whole animals. The ancient Greeks had their minotaurs, centaurs and satyrs. There are legends of werecats in Africa, and there are the skinwalkers of Navajo folklore. These legends are often accredited to people mistaking things like clinical lycanthropy, hypertrichosis, and rabies for individuals actually having some kind of spiritual or literal metamorphosis into an animal. One of the most famous and disturbing instances of the werewolf legend was Germany's Peter Stube, nicknamed the Werewolf of Bedburg. He was a 15th century farmer and was accused of transforming into a wolf and devouring many of the villages of Bedburg. He confessed under torture to committing such acts, and there have been many illustrations depicting his brutal execution. One of my earliest introductions to an anthropomorphized wolf was the grim tale, Little Red Riding Hood. Variations of the story extend across the world, but the moral and antagonist of the story is pretty much the same. Looks can be deceiving, and by principle the same applies to the werewolf myth as well. Unfortunately for my peers at the time, my love of werewolves didn't start or end at my brief obsession with wolf blood. I was also somewhat of a Harry Potter fan as a small child, although I've always preferred Lord of the Rings Don't Come For Me. My two favourite films were Prisoner of Azkaban and The Goblet of Fire. One of my favourite characters throughout the series was Remus Lupin, not only because he was one of the best teachers, but because he was a werewolf. The scene towards the end of Prisoner of Azkaban, where he changes, really captures the moment well, and far better than the book did in my opinion. I remember whenever the film was put on, I would watch the whole film just to get to this part, because I thought it was so cool. The effects haven't aged horribly, and they use this shot that is very popular in werewolf transformation scenes that I love, where they zoom into the subject's eye, it changes, and they zoom out. While I don't like Harry Potter as much as I once did, I think this scene still looks great. An American Werewolf in London has to be my most favourite werewolf movie of all time. I cannot think of any flaws that deter me from it, allowing me to watch it over and over again. The film centres around two American tourists, named Jack and David, who are attacked one night on the moors, Jack dying from his wounds, and David surviving with a bite. It is a classic retelling of The Wolfman, a tragic love story with the protagonist having to be killed in the end, despite his best efforts to fight the curse. There are some more original and humorous moments, with David being haunted by Jack and the other werewolf victims. The effects are definitely the film's crowning glory, performed by the same people who worked on the Thriller music video. I have very mixed feelings on the original Howling movie. It's not a terrible movie, and I have watched it a couple of times, but I really think it suffered from issues with its budget. For example, there is a random animated scene in the middle of the movie that is extremely jarring and did not age well. There are also some general issues with the practical effects, which make them look a bit stiff, and I have linked a very interesting video in the description comparing them to those in An American Werewolf in London. However, I think there are definitely merits to this movie, and it has some memorable moments. The same cannot be said for its sequel though. I must make a review of this movie at some point. It is so bad and such an obvious cash grab that I find it personally offensive. It sparked several other equally shit sequels as well, which I think really dragged the Howling name through the mud. I think it still retained a bit of an impact though.
What's that werewolf movie with E.T.'s mom in it?
The Howling, horror, straight ahead.
Okay, thanks.
Unlike my disdain for the cringe fest that is the 2011 remake of Teen Wolf, there will always be a place in my heart for the original 1985 film, as goofy as it is. I suppose I am kind of biased because I knew Michael J. Fox from my love of the Back to the Future series, so I always found media with him in it enjoyable because of that. This is a far sillier and more winsome depiction of werewolves, with it being a genetic trait that comes to fruition during puberty, compared to an affliction caused by an attack, with Fox's Scott Howard still succeeding at basketball despite his wolf-inspired setbacks. I'm quite proud of my summary there. I didn't even go on a rant about Buffy. In all seriousness, I had a lot of fun making this video, and I hope I was able to convey my love for this kind of thing appropriately throughout this video, as well as maybe gain the attention of those with similar interests. I have a lot more media that I would have wanted to include, but I didn't want to make this video too long, so this is what we got. I'm thinking of maybe making more videos like this in the future if you guys enjoy this one, particularly a video surrounding British and Australian children's media having a weird obsession with death and the undead outside of classic Munsters. I'll probably include the show Dead Gorgeous if I do make it, but I've also been trying to find another show for the video. I remember there being a show set in Australia or New Zealand where these kids ran a shop and were trying to stop people who died at sea from taking over or something. I remember whenever a dead person was seen through water or got water on them, they would turn blue, but have never been able to find the show as I can't remember its name. If any of you have any idea what I'm talking about, please let me know in the comments down below. Well, that's all for this video. Don't forget to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video. And as always, thanks for watching.
Nothing like a polo to ease my mind. With polos by my side, I'll always shine. The blue and green ones are my favorite kind, but I'll eat the colored ones from time to time. Cause polos is life, 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 polos is life. Sleep all